At 3 a.m., when the entire city falls into a deathly silence, sounds echo through the hospital corridors that no living soul should ever produce. I used to convince myself it was just the building settling, but that night, when the rhythmic rattling of rusty stretcher wheels stopped right outside my door, I realized I wasn't alone. When the darkness begins to whisper, there is no longer a path to escape. This happened in a small town in Pennsylvania called Blackwood. There was an old crumbling structure locals avoided like a plague, the St. Jude Rehabilitation Center. It was a mental asylum shut down in the late 1980s after a mysterious fire tore through the wards. Local legend says many patients never made it out of the flames, trapped behind locked ward doors. My friend Mark and I were obsessed with the paranormal, fueled by the bravado of youth and the desire for viral content for our YouTube channel. We decided that Friday night was the perfect time to break in and document what remained. We had no idea that the footage we were about to film would be the last thing we ever recorded. The night was bone-chilling. We pulled our SUV up to the rusted main gates around midnight. The asylum sat like a rotting gargoyle in the middle of a dense forest, its jagged, broken windows reflecting the moonlight like the cataracts of a dead man's eyes. I clicked the record button on my camera while Mark gripped a heavy-duty tactical flashlight. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of dead leaves beneath our boots, a sound that felt dangerously loud in the oppressive silence. The moment we stepped through the jagged hole in the front door, the smell hit me. It wasn't just dust, it was a cloying, heavy stench of copper, wet plaster, and something ancient and scorched. Mark whispered, "This place is heavy, man." I didn't answer. I was too busy staring through the camera viewfinder. The corridors were so long that the beam of the flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the shadows before it reached the end. The wallpaper was peeling in long, fleshy strips, and the wood was marked with deep, frantic gouges, as if someone had tried to claw their way through the very walls. As we moved deeper, a cold draft followed us, despite the stagnant air. While climbing to the second floor, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. I spun around, certain someone was watching from the landing. Mark swung the light, but the stairs were empty, save for a rusted wheelchair overturned in the corner. However, when we reached the third floor and rounded the bend, my heart stopped. That same rusted wheelchair was sitting right in the middle of the hallway, perfectly upright, facing us. Mark's voice cracked. "How did it get up here? We just saw it downstairs." We tried to rationalize it, telling ourselves maybe another group of urban explorers was messing with us. We kept moving, the camera lens shaking in my grip. Suddenly, a sound drifted out of a room to our left, the soft, rhythmic sobbing of a small child. Mark and I froze. Logic screamed at us to run, but the morbid curiosity that drives every horror story drew us toward the half-open door. I pushed it back with a slow creak. The room was empty of furniture, except for a single wooden rocking horse in the center of the floor. It was rocking back and forth with violent intensity, as if someone had just jumped off it a second before we entered. At that exact moment, a deafening crash echoed from the far end of the ward, the sound of heavy iron slamming against concrete. We bolted back into the hallway. Standing at the very end of the corridor was a silhouette. It was tall, hunched, and terrifyingly thin. It wore a tattered, blackened hospital gown that fluttered in a wind we couldn't feel. Mark yelled, "Who's there?" No answer. The figure remained motionless for a heartbeat, and then it dropped. It didn't run like a human. It dropped onto all fours and began scuttling toward us with the sickening speed of an insect. We ran. The sound of our boots and gasping breaths drowned out everything else. As we scrambled down the stairs, Mark tripped and sprawled across the landing. I reached down to haul him up when a sound from the ground floor paralyzed us both. Clack, 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 clack. The sound of a metal stretcher rolling. It was coming from the darkness ahead, cutting off our exit. We ducked into a small janitor's closet and slammed the door, locking it from the inside. In the suffocating darkness of the closet, we didn't dare breathe. Then the scratching started. Long, sharp nails dragged across the wood of the door. Then came the voices, not one but dozens, a cacophony of whispers, screams, and manic laughter all occurring at once. Mark was huddled in the corner, shaking uncontrollably. Suddenly, a dark, viscous fluid began seeping under the door. It wasn't water, it was thick, dark, and smelled of charred meat. The temperature in the small room began to rise rapidly, as if the walls themselves were turning into an oven. Then silence. Total, terrifying silence. We waited for 10 minutes, our ears ringing. I gathered enough courage to peek through the keyhole. The hallway was empty. I signaled Mark, and we stepped out, our hearts hammering against our ribs. We sprinted for the main entrance, but when we reached the foyer, I screamed. The massive oak door we had entered through was gone. In its place was a solid brick wall, weathered and covered in moss, as if it had been sealed for decades. "This can't be happening," Mark shrieked, clawing at the bricks. A cold, raspy voice whispered from directly behind us. "Are you here to stay with us?" We spun around to find the hunched figure standing inches from our faces. It had no face, just a mass of scorched, bubbling flesh and two hollow pits where eyes should have been. Heat radiated from its body like a furnace. I dropped the camera and dove through a nearby window, shattering the glass. Mark followed a split second later. We hit the overgrown bushes outside and didn't stop running until we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, the engine roared to life, and I floored it. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, my blood turned to ice. No one was in the back seat, but the rear window was fogging up, and small, charred handprints were appearing on the glass from the inside. We reached the safety of the town as the sun began to rise, but the nightmare didn't end there. The next morning, I connected my camera's memory card to my laptop to see what we had captured. The card was empty. No video files, no photos, just one single audio file. I clicked play. It wasn't the sound of our escape. It was a recording of a flat, distorted voice that said, "You left the building, but you brought a piece of us with you." Since that night, I haven't slept. Sometimes in the dead of night, I hear that familiar clack-clack of stretcher wheels in the hallway of my apartment. I know it's not my imagination. This morning, I looked in the bathroom mirror and saw 5 deep, blackened claw marks etched into the skin of my throat. The figure from the asylum didn't stay behind. It's here, standing in the corner of my eye, waiting for the light to go out. If you ever think about visiting St. Jude, don't. You might make it out, but what follows you home will never let you go. I know that dead bodies aren't supposed to speak, but that night on a desolate highway in Georgia, when that raspy whisper drifted from the darkness in the back of my ambulance, I knew my life would never be the same. Some shifts consume a person's soul, and the package we were carrying that night was a living curse. After 10 years as a paramedic, you think you've seen it all. Mangled cars, gunshot wounds, or the quiet passing of the elderly in the middle of the night. It's all routine. But from the moment the call came in from a tiny township outside Savannah, the air felt impossibly heavy. It was 2:15 a.m. The world was silent. My partner, Mark, and I were driving through a tunnel of fog-drenched pine trees. Our job was a simple transfer. Nothing urgent, no sirens needed. Just us, a body wrapped in a white sheet, and miles of empty road to the city morgue. When we arrived at the clinic, the nurse handed us the stretcher. The body under the sheet was cold, unnaturally so, colder than ice. As Mark loaded the stretcher into the back, he suddenly froze. "What is it?" I asked. Mark whispered, Did it just move?" I forced a laugh. "It's just the wind, Mark. Or you're exhausted. Let's just get this over with." We had no idea that what lay beneath that sheet was no ordinary corpse. I shut the rear doors and hopped into the driver's seat while Mark sat beside me. We started the long trek back. The road was a straight line through dense forest, where the only signs of life were the glowing eyes of deer caught in our headlights. The cabin was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the hiss of the AC. 20 minutes in, I glanced at the rearview mirror. A dim blue light illuminated the back. I noticed something. The sheet over the body seemed higher than before. It looked as if the person underneath had shifted positions. I didn't say anything to Mark, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But 5 minutes later, the sound started. Scratch, scratch. It was low, methodical, like fingernails dragging against metal. I looked at Mark. He was staring out the window, but his jaw was locked tight. He heard it too. "What was that?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "Probably just something loose in the back," I replied, though I knew better. The sound grew louder. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It was the sound of someone struggling to breathe. A long, wet, rattling sound, as if their lungs were filled with fluid. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the shoulder. We were in total darkness, no houses, no street lights. "We have to check," Mark said, his face pale. We both got out. My hands shook as I reached for the rear door handle. When I swung it open, a blast of freezing air hit us, carrying the stench of rotting meat and old chemicals. The stretcher was where we left it, but the sheet was on the floor. The body was completely exposed. The man looked ageless, his skin a mottled, bruised blue. His mouth was wide open. But the most terrifying part was his eyes. They were wide open, completely white, with no pupils, staring straight at the ceiling. "I swear to God, he was covered," Mark choked out. I forced myself to reach out and touch his wrist to check for a pulse. There was nothing. His skin felt like stone. I pulled the sheet back over his face, tucking it in tight. "Let's go, Mark. It's just gas. Bodies shift when gases escape. It's science." We scrambled back into the front and locked the doors. I pushed the ambulance to 90 miles per hour. I just wanted to see the city lights. Then, 10 minutes later, a loud thud echoed from the back. Thump. It sounded like someone had jumped off the stretcher. I looked in the mirror. The stretcher was empty. The sheet was crumpled in a corner. The body was gone. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Mark, look back!" Mark didn't have the courage to turn around. Right then, a sound came from the small partition window behind our heads. Tap, tap, tap. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I screamed and hit the brakes again, the ambulance skidding sideways in the middle of the road. Through the fog, I saw the reflection in the glass. A pale bluish hand slid up the partition window. Then a face appeared. Those white eyes. The man wasn't dead, or if he was, he wasn't resting. His lips were moving. No sound came out, but his jaw worked rhythmically, as if he were chewing on something. Suddenly, he slammed his forehead against the glass. Crack. The glass didn't shatter, but a spiderweb of fractures appeared. Mark scrambled to open his door, but the lock was jammed. "It won't open! John, it's stuck!" he shrieked. The thing in the back made a sound. It was like a laugh, but it sounded like dry leaves being crushed. It whispered a name. It wasn't my name. It was Mark's. Mark, look back at me." Mark went rigid. He sat perfectly still, staring ahead. I fought with the ignition, the engine coughing and sputtering. Finally, it roared to life. I floored it, but the scratching didn't stop. It moved. It sounded like something was climbing onto the roof of the ambulance. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy footsteps. The metal roof of the ambulance began to groan and dent inward under the weight. I gripped the steering wheel, screaming at the top of my lungs. Mark was curled in the footwell, sobbing and praying. Suddenly, with a violent crash, the rear doors flew open. In the mirror, I saw the white sheet fly out into the wind, followed by a dark shape that tumbled onto the asphalt and rolled into the darkness. I didn't stop, not for a second. I drove straight to the precinct in the center of town. When I climbed out, my legs gave way. When the police and other paramedics inspected the vehicle, they were speechless. The back of the ambulance was empty. The stretcher was overturned. But the most chilling part was the exterior. There were 4 massive, deep indentations on the roof. Handprints, as if something incredibly heavy had tried to crush the van from above. And on the partition window where I saw that face, there was no blood, only a smear of grave dirt and the smell of ancient decay. The police searched that highway for hours. They combed the woods, but they never found the body. When they questioned the nurse at the clinic, she revealed that the body had been found 3 days prior in the basement of an abandoned church. No ID, no records, just a nameless man left in the dark. It's been a year now. I quit the job. Mark is in a psychiatric facility. He doesn't speak anymore. He just screams in the middle of the night. I can't sleep either, because every night when the house goes silent, I hear it against my bedroom window. Tap, tap, tap. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I know he's back. He didn't just want a ride that night. He was choosing one of us. And since Mark can no longer answer, he's standing outside my door, whispering my name into the cracks of the wood. The next time you see an ambulance driving silently past you in the dead of night, take a look at the back window. You might just see a pale face pressed against the glass, smiling at you. I looked into the mirror, but my own reflection wasn't there. Instead, I saw something worse than any nightmare. A shadowy figure standing right behind me, grinning. It was a small town in Louisiana called Black Creek. Deep woods and swampy marshlands surrounded everything. I had gone there to clear out my distant uncle's old house, a place that had sat abandoned for years. The locals always picked up their pace when walking past it. Being from the city, I never put much stock in supernatural stories, but the moment I stepped inside, the hair on my arm stood up. The air felt stagnant, heavy with a foul stench, like rotting meat mixed with damp ancient cloth. I spent the first day scrubbing grime off the ground floor. Everything seemed normal until I found the locked room at the far corner of the attic. It was a small door with a rusted padlock. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a hammer from the next room and smashed the lock. As I pushed the door open, the sharp, overwhelming scent of herbal incense hit my lungs. The room was pitch black. I flicked on my flashlight. In the center stood a round table covered in black velvet. Arranged around it were disturbing items. Dried bones, small clay dolls with needles driven through their eyes, and a cluster of black candles. Symbols were scrawled across the walls. I tried to tell myself it was just a strange hobby of my uncle's. But then I opened the old leather-bound diary resting on the table. My blood turned to ice. The pages were filled with names and photographs of people. Over every picture, "Offering" was written in red ink. My father's photo was there. Underneath it, a note read, "A soul for a lifetime of prosperity." My father had died young under mysterious circumstances. My hands began to shake. Right then, I heard a dry scratching sound. It was coming from the corner of the room. I swung the flashlight toward it. Nothing. Just an old wardrobe. I grabbed the diary and bolted downstairs. I tried to sleep that night, but the silence was too loud. I felt like eyes were watching me through the bedroom door. In the middle of the night, a sound drifted up from the living room. Someone was humming. It was low, sharp, and tuneless. I climbed out of bed, flashlight in hand. Every wooden step groaned under my weight. When I reached the living room, I saw my uncle's rocking chair moving on its own. I shone the light on it, empty. But on the floor, I saw something that nearly made me scream. A circle of salt had been laid out, and inside it lay the severed head of a black rooster. The blood was still fresh. I wasn't alone. I lunged for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if heavy iron chains were holding it from the outside. I tried to smash a window, but the glass felt as solid as stone. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed from the kitchen. I walked toward it, my heart hammering against my ribs. Scattered across the kitchen floor were those clay dolls from the attic. Every single one of them had their faces turned toward me, and the most terrifying part, every doll's face had been molded into a perfect miniature replica of mine. I backed away, and that's when the shadow manifested. It was tall, draped in a long black cloak. I couldn't see a face, but its eyes glowed like dying embers. It didn't speak. It just reached out a hand holding that same diary. I realized then that this wasn't just a curse. It was a blood pact that stretched back through generations. I sprinted back up the stairs. With every step, I felt hands invisible and cold grabbing at my ankles. I slammed my bedroom door and locked it. Violent blows began to rain down on the wood. The door began to splinter. I tried to crawl under the bed, but the floorboards beneath were covered in those same black symbols. Suddenly, every candle in the room ignited on its own. The flames were a ghostly blue. An unholy light filled the space. I saw my shadow on the wall, but it wasn't moving with me. When I waved my hand, the shadow stayed perfectly still. Then it began to peel itself off the wall. I managed to force the window open. Below was a drop into the dark swamp. I looked back and saw the hooded figure standing inside the room. It began to chant. The language wasn't human. Every word felt like hot lead being poured into my ears. My head spun. Losing my balance, I tumbled out of the window and fell into the dark. When I woke up the next morning, I was lying at the edge of the woods. My body ached. I stumbled toward the road and tried to flag down a passing car. But when the driver saw me, he shrieked in terror and floored the accelerator. I didn't understand why. I found a small motel nearby and ducked into the restroom. When I looked into the mirror, my heart nearly stopped. My face was no longer human. My skin was pale and leathery like the clay dolls. My eyes were sunken and black. And right beneath my throat, the next offering was etched in bright red ink. I still wander the edges of those woods. I can't stand the daylight anymore. I've realized I'm no longer a person. I'm a piece of the ritual now. Sometimes at night, I stand in front of lone travelers just to see the look of pure terror on their faces. Because I know that soon, to satisfy this hunger, I will have to drag someone else into the circle. You might think this is just a story, but look into the dark corner of your room right now. Is a shadow moving? Do you hear a faint humming? Be careful. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Can I join you on your next journey? Or perhaps I'm already in the room with you. You just haven't looked in the mirror yet. This game started long ago and it ends with our blood. Isn't your breath getting a little heavy? That's how it starts. That is the price of the black magic. Do you think you're safe? I'm standing right behind you. Just don't forget to look in the mirror.